I never imagined that love could come with a price tag, especially not the kind of love that grows quietly over years, the kind that survives loss, loneliness, and sacrifice. But everything changed the moment my grandson Adam was born, because in that fragile, beautiful instant when I first held him in my arms, I believed that life was finally giving something back to me after taking so much away, after losing my husband and spending years pouring every ounce of my strength into raising my son. Daniel, who had once been my whole world, my purpose, my pride, and I truly thought that when he married Clara, my family would only grow stronger, that I would gain a daughter as well as a grandson. But from the beginning, Clara kept a distance that I couldn't quite understand, her politeness always feeling rehearsed, her smiles never reaching her eyes, and though I told myself she just needed time, that every new relationship takes patience, there were moments, small but sharp, where her words carried an edge, subtle comments about boundaries, independence, and how things are different now, which I tried to ignore because I didn't want to create tension. I didn't want to risk losing the only family I had left, so I stayed quiet and hopeful, but hope can be a dangerous thing when it blinds you to what's right in front of you. And everything became painfully clear just a week after Adam's birth when Clara asked me to sit down in the living room, her posture stiff, her expression cold in a way I had never seen before, and Daniel was there too, sitting beside her but strangely distant, avoiding my gaze as if something heavy hung in the air that only they understood. And at first I thought maybe she wanted to discuss visiting schedules or how I could help with the baby, something normal, something loving. So I smiled and said gently that I was happy to follow whatever rules made her comfortable, but what she said next didn't feel real, it felt like something out of a nightmare I hadn't yet woken up from, because she crossed her arms and said in a flat, businesslike tone that if I wanted to see Adam regularly, it would cost me $1,200 a month. And for a moment I genuinely thought she was joking. I even let out a small, confused laugh, waiting for Daniel to smile or shake his head or say, "Mom, she's kidding." But he didn't. He just sat there in silence, staring down at his hands as if he couldn't bear to look at me, and that silence was louder than anything she could have said. It crushed something inside me that I didn't even know was still fragile, and when I realized she was serious, when I saw the unwavering look in her eyes, I felt my heart sink in a way that made it hard to breathe, because this wasn't just about money, it was about what I meant to them, what my love was worth in their eyes. And when I asked softly if she was serious, hoping for even a hint of hesitation, she simply nodded and began explaining it as if she were discussing a contract, mentioning daycare costs, emotional labor, boundaries, and how access to the child wasn't something to be taken for granted, as if I were some stranger trying to earn the right to step into their lives rather than a grandmother who had spent years dreaming of this moment. And I turned to Daniel one last time, searching his face for the boy I had raised, the one who used to run to me when he was scared, the one who promised he would always take care of me, but that boy was gone, replaced by a man who chose silence over standing up for his own mother, and in that moment I understood something painful and undeniable. I wasn't just being asked to pay for visits. I was being shown my place, and it was far lower than I had ever imagined. Yet despite the humiliation burning inside me, despite the tears threatening to spill, I agreed, not because I believed it was right, but because the thought of losing Adam completely was something I couldn't bear. Because even if it meant swallowing my pride and turning my love into something transactional, I told myself it was temporary, that things would change, that Clara would soften, that Daniel would eventually realize what he was allowing to happen. But deep down, a quiet voice whispered that something fundamental had already broken, something that might never be repaired. And as I handed over that first payment, feeling as though I was buying moments that should have been given freely, I realized that love, when treated like a commodity, begins to lose its warmth, its meaning, and its truth. And yet I clung to the hope that holding my grandson, even under these painful conditions, would somehow be enough to keep my heart from completely shattering, even though a part of me already knew that this was only the beginning of something far more painful than I was prepared to face. I paid every single month without missing a date, even when it felt like I was slowly trading pieces of my dignity just to hold on to moments that should have been mine by love, not by obligation. And at first I convinced myself that it was temporary, that Clara would eventually soften once she saw how much I cared for Adam, that Daniel would wake up one day and realize how wrong this was. But as weeks turned into months, nothing changed except the growing heaviness in my chest, because every Visit felt less like a family reunion and more like an appointment that had been scheduled, monitored, and controlled down to the minute. Clara would greet me with that same distant expression, sometimes not even offering a proper hello before reminding me how much time I had. "You have 1 hour today," she would say, as if she were granting me a favor rather than acknowledging a bond that existed long before she entered our lives, and I would nod quietly, forcing a smile, because the moment I stepped inside, Adam would reach out for me with those innocent, joyful eyes that knew nothing of the cold arrangement surrounding us, and for that 1 hour, I would forget everything else. I would sing to him, hold him close, memorize the softness of his cheeks and the sound of his laughter, trying to store those fleeting moments deep inside my heart as if they could somehow last longer than the ticking clock on the wall. But even in those precious seconds, Clara's presence lingered like a shadow, sometimes sitting across the room watching me in silence, other times scrolling on her phone, but never truly leaving, always reminding me that I was being observed, evaluated, measured. And when the hour was up, she would stand without hesitation and say, "Time's over," and no matter how tightly Adam held onto my finger or how desperately I wished for just a few more minutes, I would have to let go, each goodbye feeling like a small heartbreak that repeated itself over and over again. And Daniel, the one person who could have changed everything, remained distant, his silence becoming more painful than any harsh words Clara could have spoken, because silence from someone you love is not empty. It is filled with everything they choose not to say. And one evening, after yet another visit that ended too soon, I found him alone in the kitchen, and something inside me finally pushed past the fear of confrontation. "Daniel," I said softly, my voice trembling despite my effort to stay calm, "how can you let this happen?" And for a moment, he didn't respond. He just sighed as if I had become a burden he didn't know how to carry. And when he finally spoke, his words cut deeper than I expected. "Mom, please don't make things harder than they already are. Clara just wants structure." And I felt something inside me crack at that word, structure. As if reducing love to a system made it easier to justify what they were doing. "Structure?" I repeated, my voice breaking despite myself. "She's putting a price on my grandson, on my love for him." And he ran a hand through his hair, clearly frustrated, but not at the situation, at me. "She's his mother," he said firmly. "You have to respect her rules." And in that moment I realized that he wasn't going to stand up for me, not now, maybe not ever. And the pain of that realization settled deep within me like something heavy and immovable, because it wasn't just about Adam anymore. It was about the son I had raised, the one I thought I knew, the one who had once promised to always be there for me. And yet here he was, choosing silence, choosing comfort over truth. And that night, when I returned home, the house felt emptier than it ever had before, the walls echoing with memories of a life that now seemed so distant. And I sat alone in the quiet, replaying every moment, every word, every look, trying to understand where it all went wrong, questioning whether I had failed somehow, whether I had given too much or too little, whether love itself had somehow become something that could be measured and sold. And I didn't sleep that night, not because I was angry, but because something inside me had shifted in a way I couldn't ignore anymore. The pain was still there, sharp and undeniable, but beneath it, something else was beginning to form, something quieter but stronger. A realization that if they were going to treat me like a transaction, if they were going to reduce my presence in their lives to something that could be bought and controlled, then I could no longer keep responding with silent acceptance, because love without respect becomes a wound that never heals. And for the first time since this all began, I understood that continuing like this would only break me further, that waiting for them to change was a hope built on nothing but illusion. And as the night stretched on and the weight of everything settled into my bones, I made a decision. Not out of anger or revenge, but out of something far more necessary, self-respect. Because if they had turned love into something transactional, then perhaps it was time for me to stop playing the role they had forced upon me and start seeing the situation for what it truly was, not a family bound by love, but a relationship defined by power, silence, and control. And I knew, deep down, that something had to change, even if I wasn't yet sure what that change would look like. Something inside me had shifted after that sleepless night, not loudly or suddenly, but in a quiet, steady way that felt stronger than the grief I had been carrying for months. Because for the first time I stopped hoping that things would fix themselves and started seeing the situation clearly for what it truly was, a relationship built on control where my love was being measured, priced, and limited. And once that realization settled in my heart, I knew I could no longer continue as I had been. Silently paying, silently hurting, silently waiting for a change that was never going to come. So instead of arguing or pleading, I did something that surprised even me. I became calm, distant, and observant. I stopped reacting to Clara's cold tone, stopped trying to read Daniel's silence, and most importantly, I started remembering things I had once pushed aside, details about the past that suddenly carried a different weight, because for years I had supported Daniel in ways he rarely acknowledged. I had paid for his education when money was tight, helped him through difficult times when he struggled to find his path, and when he married Clara, I had even contributed significantly to the down payment of their house, not as a loan, not as something to hold over them, but as a gesture of love, a way to ensure they started their life together with stability and comfort. And at the time, I never questioned it, I never asked for anything in return, but there was one thing I had done quietly, almost instinctively, something I hadn't thought much about until now. I had kept the legal ownership of the property in my name, telling myself it was simply a precaution for my own security in old age, not out of distrust but out of practicality. And now, that single decision stood in front of me like a door I had never noticed before, a door that could change everything if I chose to open it, and for days I thought about it carefully, weighing my emotions against my sense of right and wrong, because this wasn't about revenge, not really. It was about reclaiming something that had been taken from me piece by piece, my dignity, my place in my own family, my right to love without conditions. And finally, with a calmness I didn't expect, I made an appointment with my lawyer, sitting across from him with a steady voice as I explained everything, not the emotional pain, not the betrayal, but the facts, the ownership papers, the financial history, the arrangement that had somehow turned me into a paying visitor in my grandson's life. And when I asked him if I had the legal right to reclaim the house, he reviewed the documents carefully before nodding in a matter-of-fact way. "Yes, you do," he said, and those three simple words carried more power than anything I had felt in months, because for the first time, I realized I wasn't as powerless as they had made me believe. And after leaving his office, I sat in my car for a long time, not crying, not hesitating, just breathing in the weight of the decision I was about to make, because I knew once I took this step, there would be no going back. But I also knew that continuing as I had been was no longer an option. So I began quietly putting everything into motion, starting with something small but significant. I stopped the monthly payments. I didn't announce it, didn't explain it. I simply didn't send the money. And it didn't take long for Clara to notice. Her call came the very next day, her tone sharp and impatient as she asked why the payment hadn't been made, and for the first time since all of this began, I didn't feel the need to justify myself or soften my response. "I won't be paying anymore," I said calmly, my voice steady in a way that surprised even me, and there was a brief silence on the other end before she replied coldly, "Then you won't be seeing Adam." And those words, which once would have shattered me, now felt different. They still hurt, deeply, but they no longer controlled me, because something inside me had changed, something stronger than fear, and I took a slow breath before responding in a quiet, firm tone, "We'll see about that." And then I ended the call before she could say anything else, my hands trembling slightly as I placed the phone down, not from weakness but from the release of finally standing my ground. And in the days that followed, I worked closely with my lawyer, preparing everything carefully, ensuring that when the time came, there would be no confusion, no room for argument, just the truth laid out clearly and legally. And through it all, I didn't contact Daniel. I didn't try to explain or warn him, because I had spent months waiting for him to understand without being told. And if he hadn't seen the truth by now, then perhaps he needed to face it in a way that could no longer be ignored. And as the plan quietly came together, I felt a strange sense of peace settle over me, not happiness, not satisfaction, but something steadier, something rooted in self-respect and clarity, because for the first time in a long while, I wasn't acting out of desperation or pain. I was acting out of strength, out of the understanding that love should never require you to lose yourself completely. And as I prepared for what was to come, I knew that this wasn't just about a house or money or even access to my grandson. It was about reminding them, and perhaps even myself, that I was not someone who could be reduced to a transaction, not someone whose love could be bought or controlled. And whatever happened next, I was ready to face it, because I had finally stopped being afraid of losing what I had already been forced to live without. The day everything finally came to a head began quietly, almost deceptively calm, as if the world itself was holding its breath in anticipation of what was about to unfold. And as I stood outside Daniel's house with my lawyer beside me, I felt a steady rhythm in my chest, not fear, not hesitation, but something resolute and unshakable, because this moment had been building for weeks, perhaps even longer if I was honest with myself. And when Daniel opened the door and saw me standing there with a stranger in a suit, the confusion on his face was immediate, quickly replaced by a flicker of unease that told me he already sensed something was wrong. "Mom," he said, his voice uncertain, stepping aside as we entered, and Clara appeared moments later, her expression tightening the instant she noticed who I had brought with me, her eyes narrowing as if she were trying to assess a situation she could no longer control. "What is this?" she demanded, her tone sharp but laced with a hint of anxiety she couldn't quite hide, and I didn't rush to answer. I simply stepped further into the living room, taking in the space that I had once helped create, the walls I had unknowingly invested in, the home that had become the center of so much pain. And then my lawyer spoke, his voice calm and professional as he explained that the property was legally owned by me and that I was formally requesting full possession. And the silence that followed felt heavier than anything I had experienced before, because in that moment, the illusion they had been living in shattered completely. Clara's face drained of color as she shook her head in disbelief, insisting that it couldn't be true, that there must be some mistake. But there was no mistake, only a reality she had never bothered to consider. And Daniel looked at me then, really looked at me for the first time in months, his expression filled with shock and something deeper, something that resembled regret. "Mom, what are you doing?" he asked, his voice breaking slightly, and I met his gaze steadily, not with anger, not with cruelty, but with a quiet firmness that left no room for misunderstanding. "I'm taking back what was always mine," I said, my words simple but carrying the weight of everything that had led to this moment. And Clara immediately tried to argue, her voice rising as she spoke about fairness, about how this was their home, how I was being unreasonable, but her words no longer held the power they once did, because the dynamic had shifted in a way she couldn't control. And when Daniel asked me why I was doing this, I didn't hesitate. "Because you let her put a price on my love," I said, my voice steady but filled with a quiet sadness that even I couldn't hide. "And you said nothing." And those words seemed to hit him harder than anything else, his shoulders slumping as the truth settled over him. Because deep down he knew it was true. He knew that his silence had allowed everything to happen, that his inaction had spoken louder than any words ever could. And in the weeks that followed, the process moved forward exactly as my lawyer had said it would, legally, methodically, leaving no room for denial or delay. And within a month, they had no choice but to leave the house, the same house that had once been a symbol of support and love, now becoming a lesson neither of them would ever forget. And during that time, there were no more calls from Clara, no more demands or conditions, just a silence that mirrored the one Daniel had given me for so long. And then one afternoon, there was a knock on my door, and when I opened it, I found Daniel standing there alone, his posture uncertain, his eyes filled with something I hadn't seen in a long time, humility. And for a moment neither of us spoke, the weight of everything that had happened hanging between us, before he finally broke the silence. "I'm sorry, Mom," he said, his voice trembling in a way that told me these words were not easy for him. "I should have said something, I should have stopped it." And I listened quietly, not interrupting, not rushing to respond, because this was the moment I had once hoped for, the moment when he would finally see what he had allowed. And when I asked him if he truly understood, he nodded, tears slipping down his face as he admitted that he had been wrong, that he had chosen the easy path instead of the right one. And hearing that didn't erase the pain, it didn't undo the months of hurt or the distance that had grown between us, but it did open a door, a small one, fragile but real. And after a long silence, I stepped aside and let him in, not because everything was forgiven, but because I still believed in the possibility of rebuilding something better, something honest. And in time, I was able to see Adam again, not as a transaction, not as a scheduled visit measured in minutes, but as what I had always been to him, his grandmother. And as I held him in my arms once more, feeling his laughter echo against my heart, I realized that what I had done was never about revenge in the way people often imagine it. It wasn't about causing pain or proving power. It was about reclaiming my worth, about reminding them and myself that love should never come with a price, and that respect is not something you beg for, it is something you demand through the way you choose to stand for yourself. And in the end, the sweetest part of it all was not the house or the legal victory, but the quiet understanding that I had not lost myself in the process, that I had faced betrayal without becoming bitter, and that I had shown, through my actions rather than my words, that love, when rooted in dignity, will always find its way back to where it truly belongs.